Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for everybody who loves stories about interesting people and events told by those who uncovered them from within their own family trees. This, we hope, will inspire you to discover and celebrate your history and your story. Cuba's revolutionary history dates back to the early 1950s, when the seeds were first planted for the eventual armed overthrow of Fulgencio Batista's government by Fidel Castro and his revolutionaries on January 1st, 1959. Against all odds and despite many attempts to remove him from power, Castro remained as Cuba's leader until 2008, after nearly 50 years as the nation's leader. Our guest on this episode of Your History, Your Story is historian, university professor, and award-winning author, Dr. Luis Martinez-Fernandez. Luis, who was born in Cuba, is a professor of history at the University of Central Florida and has an expertise in the areas of Latin America, the Caribbean, and Latino Hispanic politics, culture, and society. Luis will be discussing his book, Revolutionary Cuba, A History, and will take us through the tumultuous period in Cuban history that includes Castro's rise to power, his alignment with communism and the Soviet Union, and events such as the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which almost led to a nuclear world war in October of 1962. I'd now like to welcome Luis to our show. Welcome, Luis.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, James.
Well, I'm very glad to have you on the show. And just for our listeners, back in October, I looked at the calendar and I realized that it was the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I didn't see a whole lot on the news, but I do know that it was an incredibly significant period in world history because, frankly, we almost had a nuclear world war, and it was a big, big deal. I thought to myself, I don't know all about why it happened, who the players were. I mean, I knew Cuba, I knew the Soviet Union, I know the United States, but what about more detail of what happened? What caused it to build up, and what can I learn about it? And really, frankly, what can the world learn from what happened there? So I looked around and Kelly did some research and came across you. You are a professor of history at the University of Central Florida. You were born in Cuba. You specialize in Latin American and Caribbean studies. You're an author, a syndicated columnist, and you wrote a book called Revolutionary Cuba, A History, among many other books as well. And you and I have spoken, and I thought, what a great guest to have on our podcast to give us some background about Cuban history and specifically the period of time leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So before we get into that, tell us about your background, Luis. You were born in Cuba. Can you tell us your background and what led you into the passion of history and telling history and becoming a professor of history?
Well, yes, I'm a strong believer, and it's one of the running themes in your program that life and history are combined. And in my case, I was born in Cuba in 1960, which was going into the second year of the Cuban Revolution, not just any year. Then we left Cuba as exiles, actually refugees, in 1962. I was just 2 years old. Then when we arrived in Miami, there were many of us coming in at the same time. So there weren't that many job opportunities for my father, who had worked for an American company in Cuba, actually a very important company, given that Cuba was an agrarian society dependent on the production of sugarcane and sugar, which was International Harvester. So he was an executive of that company. All of a sudden, we left literally with the clothes on our backs and ended up in the refugee center in Miami. And as I said, there were many of us coming in at the same time. There weren't that many job opportunities. And my father was contacted by one of his former bosses in Cuba and said, there's an opportunity with the company in Peru. And that's how we ended up there. Not a very common trajectory for Cuban exiles, most of which stayed in the United States. So we ended up going to Peru in 1962. Actually, I was 8 years old in 1968, and I'm watching TV, and there's a military coup. The soldiers in their uniforms walking into the bedroom of the democratically elected president, and they dragged him out of there in his pajamas.
Oh boy.
An 8-year-old shouldn't see those things.
No, not at all.
And let alone have to grapple with them. And then we left again because it was a leftist government that was put in place. And my father saw some of the same headlines that he had seen in Cuba in 59, 60, 61. And then again, exile again. And we went back to the Caribbean, Puerto Rico. I couldn't help it, actually, to become a historian, because trying to make sense of all these changes and travels. I mean, why was I there and not somewhere else? All of that guided me to have an interest in history from an early age. And I was just fascinated by the colonial architecture, some of the colonial fortifications in San Juan. I had also been stimulated in Peru. I'm a strong believer in students going in field trips, not to water treatment plants, which I don't know who came up with that idea, but to museums and historic sites. So all of that was building up inside of me. And when it came time to select a profession and a major in college, it was history. And then I continued, and I've dedicated my professional life to the field of history, as you said, mostly Cuban history. And I wrote several books on the 19th century. Then I wrote the book that you mentioned earlier, Revolutionary Cuba History. It's not easy to write about something that controversial, about which so many people believe they know, and everybody has an opinion. And then I moved on to other things. The next book after that dealt with early colonial Cuba. And now I'm writing about the world. I'm writing about global developments in Ukraine and in the Caribbean, in the United States. And I moved on from just a focus on Cuba.
Your latest book is called When the World Turned Upside Down. That's the new book that just came out, right?
Yes, it's a very different book. You know, you develop different passions along your career. And one of my early passions was opinion journalism. I owe it to my history professors at the University of Puerto Rico who wrote history books, but they also wrote syndicated columns for the local newspapers. And I thought, well, I'd like to try that. So when I was in my mid-20s, I would write regular columns for San Juan's dailies. Of course, when you go on to pursue a PhD, almost everything else in your life has to be set aside. And I, of course, got the PhD, turned the dissertation into a book, and then the next book, and then the next book. But that fascination with the immediacy of reaching people, and then having far more people read what you're writing than a history book. History books don't sell that many copies, but when you're a columnist, you're going to be read by a broader audience, and it's always fun to hear from individuals who read some of your work and comment. Sometimes they're happy about what you wrote, and sometimes they're not, but at least your word is getting out there.
You mean not everybody's happy about what you write?
Definitely not. These are difficult times, James, and the world has changed dramatically Today, I was giving a keynote speech for a group of social studies supervisors in Florida. And one of them asked me if I had written about ChatGPT or if I was thinking about it. I said, well, actually, I wrote about that in January. And these are transformations that are not just a regular technological advancement that will make life easier. No, this has the potential of changing the world as we know it. 2 years ago, I wrote a column on Google Translate and what that meant for translators, because it's been improved over time. And I remember when I closed that column, I said, well, I hope nobody comes up with the idea of a Google column, which can write columns. And guess what? It's here.
Yeah, early retirement, right?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to think, and this is my experience, that art or writings or any other creation by artificial intelligence is devoid of a soul. And I don't know whether they're going to be able to change that, but as we speak, we're talking about lifeless, not human representations of aesthetics, whether it's paintings, whether it's an essay, any other form of art.
I agree completely. And talk about having heart and soul. Your love of history comes a lot from experiencing it, being part of it. I mean, you were only 2 years old in 1962, but that was the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was a very turbulent time. And then, as you said, you went to Peru, and then you had more history happening to you. And then, you were naturally curious. So you have this passion for learning. And now you're taking all of your research and your books and your columns that you've written, all that knowledge and your love of history and telling history. Now you are sharing that with your students and your readers, the people reading your books and your columns. I think that's terrific. So let's now talk about Cuba. And before we speak about revolutionary Cuba and Castro's rise to power, can you give us a little nutshell of Cuba's history prior to Castro? That's not no small order there, but can you encapsulate it for me?
Sure. I'm fortunate to teach a history of Cuba every semester. And so what you're asking me is to do my best to, in a few minutes, sort of condense all of that history. Well, Cuba has a fascinating and dramatic history. Cuba is a window onto many of the global processes when we talk about colonization, when we talk about the establishment of the plantation system. Of course, the twin pillars are slavery and sugar. And those two aspects of Cuban history have really shaped Cuba, the culture, the society. They have shaped, on the one hand, I'm convinced of this, the authoritarian strain in our history, which has been very strong, and also the resistance, the way slaves resisted slavery in the 1700s and the 1800s with humor, for example, which we don't think of humor and joking and making fun of masters as a form of resistance. But those things become part of the culture. And that's why Cuba is so rich in political humor. Fidel Castro didn't like that. He does have a sense, he did have a sense of humor, but not when it was about him. There were some very famous cartoonists who created a magazine that was called Zigzag. And just a few weeks after Castro came to power, he banned that magazine completely. Now, some of them went into exile, and guess where they ended up working? For Mad Magazine. So Cuban humor made its way. The creators of Spy versus Spy.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I remember that.
Yeah, I grew up on Mad Magazine, and it explains my penchant for political satire. Those are very Cuban characteristics. So slavery, the plantations, the proximity to the United States, that is a factor that has played out historically, even before the United States acquired Cuba temporarily in 1898 and then turned it into a neo-colony. That proximity, we're talking about very intimate ties between the two economies. Cuba producing sugar and other tropical staples for the United States providing Cuba with manufactures and other goods, rice, for example. I just saw in the news earlier this week some coverage on U.S. chicken being sold in Cuba. That's been the case. So these connections are very important. And of course, Spanish colonialism and the Cubans' efforts to fight off the Spaniards. Those of you who are familiar with Latin American history know that between around 1815 all the way to around 1830, the various nations of Latin America declared their independence from Spain, with the exception of Cuba and Puerto Rico. So what happened was that the whole brunt of Spanish colonialism, the excess priests, the excess bureaucrats, the excess military men, ended up in Cuba, and Cuba was exploited. It was exploited by Spain, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Spaniards were able to have the standard of living they had, thanks in great measure to all of the profits that were extracted from Cuba. All of that on the backs of 750,000 slaves.
Oh, boy.
So I should also mention Jose Marti. I think everybody in this country should know who Jose Marti was, the freedom fighter, the poet, the essayist, the journalist, the political organizer. He was a martyr. You live close to New York City, and I'm sure you've seen the south part of Central Park. There are the three statues of the great liberators of Latin America: Jose de San Martin from Argentina, Simón Bolívar from Colombia and Venezuela, and then Jose Marti, our Jose Marti. Well, guess what? The other two were generals. They fought for decades. They crossed the Andes back and forth, and they died of old age. But our Jose Marti, on his first day of battle, is killed. And he showed up. Some say that it was a white horse. He was in a three-piece suit with a little pistol, and he charged against the Spaniards, and there he was killed. So when you see that statue, the other two generals are on their horses, but Jose Marti is falling off the horse already dead. So it's a tragic history. It's a history that is very revolutionary. Why was there a Cuban Revolution in 1959? Well, there was a revolutionary spirit dating back to the 1800s. And then there was a so-called revolution in 1933. And I'm a strong believer that history is the culture that we inherit, because I found one day, I love archives and finding interesting materials. I came across, this was in Nashville of all places, in the archives of the Southern Baptist Church. They had an archive and a collection that pertained to Cuba. And I saw a third grade writing notebook dated, I think it may have been 1933, if I recall correctly. And this was a young girl. Her name is clearly written, and she's learning how to write with sentences such as, Cuba te dio la vida, dásela si te la pide. Cuba gave you your life. You need to give it back to Cuba if Cuba demands it.
Really?
You're a third grader and you're learning how to read and write. That's the spirit of Jose Marti. Now, I will say, and that spirit is not as strong as it used to be. I'm not going to sit here in the comfort of my office and question the courage of fellow Cubans who stayed behind It's unfair to do that because it's one thing to criticize from the outside, and it's another to be there under a regime that is based on terror and oppression. We read in the news that in Russia, and by the way, Russia and Cuba are coming back together in very cozy terms, that in Russia, if you say this is a war, that can get you 10 years in jail. Well, in Cuba is not that different. Now, let me close by saying that, unfortunately, many of the students of Cuban history, I would say most of them, have a festive, celebratory view of what transpired in Cuba. And that's unfortunate because that distorts the reality of a regime where there were many idealistic people, many who sacrificed, and who wanted to create a different Cuba, a fair Cuba, a democratic Cuba. But that was hijacked by Fidel Castro and company. And what makes it harder for me to really stomach is the fact that in this country, so many Cuban scholars who have the same freedoms I have to talk with you without any fear of retribution from the state, that they're still celebrating that, and they see no evil.
That is incredible to hear that. And I think about, when I think of Cuban history, I understand that you had a mixture of people. You had indigenous people with indigenous backgrounds. You had an enslaved population that had brought to Cuba to work on plantations. And then you had the Spaniards who were there. Mm-hmm. So you have this sort of rich culture of different people of different backgrounds and traditions. But what you're saying is that there's this spirit of really the spirit of revolution is there. But at this point, you've got now something different happens in the 1950s. It's a revolutionary spirit, but there's something different about it, isn't there?
Well, yes, and particularly once the revolutionaries took over in 1960, Fidel Castro had promised elections. They never materialized. Now, I'll be honest with you, I do not engage Viva Castro scholars or individuals in any conversation because it's not worth it, because they're not willing to see all of the pain and all of the exile. Exile is very painful. Actually, exile was not strange to Cubans who in the 1800s, during the Cuban War of Independence, there were over 150,000 Cubans who settled in the United States as exiles. That is in the 1800s. Many places like Tampa, Key West, New York, Philadelphia. Again, this is something that few people know, and they should know. Cuba had concentration camps under Spanish rule. As many as 250,000 Cubans died in concentration camps. These were the Spaniards in the 1890s. Why did they do that? Because the Cuban population was supporting Cuban rebels, and the Spanish government didn't want that support. So what they did was that they got the rural population into concentration camps in cities, and they died because who's producing the food? So again, I go back to the theme of Cuba having a very dramatic history, a very revolutionary and convulsed history, and one that I'm proud of. Cuba today, unfortunately, is a huge mess, but I'm proud of what Cubans have accomplished over the centuries. Few people know that Havana was the second largest city in the hemisphere after Mexico City, that it was modern, that it had the second largest opera theater anywhere in the world, that European fashions reached Havana before they reached anywhere else. It was a cosmopolitan, very culturally rich society. But now that I said that, I must also say that it was unequal, that there was oppression, that there was an elite that looked down upon the working classes and everybody else on the island. And when you have those circumstances, then that can explode someday. And that's why support for Castro and the rebels originally was about 95%. There are polls that were taken. So he appealed to those grievances and those painful experiences.
This is a really good time to segue into 1952. Let's look at 1952. Batista returns to power. He had actually been in power prior to 1952, back in the 40s. Is that correct?
Indirectly, he was directly in power after 1933, and then he had puppet presidents. But his first time around, even though he was a military leader, it wasn't a very oppressive dictatorship. Actually, political parties were legalized. There was a communist party, and Batista named communist leaders into his cabinet. Interestingly enough, some of them then later served under Fidel Castro, who was not a communist originally, and I don't think
Right.
he ever was.
Oh, that is interesting. We're going to talk about that in a second. So, but in 1952, when Batista comes into power again, he was from 52 to 59. Tell us about that period of time. What was going on in the Batista regime?
Okay. I'm a strong believer in defending democracy. In this country, for example, I tell my students, and when I write, democracy is vulnerable. It must be protected. And what happened in Cuba was that Cuba had a democracy. Ironically, after Batista left power indirectly in 1944, there was a very progressive party in power. And unfortunately, they did not take care of democracy because they were very corrupt. This is almost word for word what we saw happening in Venezuela later at the beginning of this century. You have democratic rule, but the democratic leaders are corrupt. They don't care about the masses and their plight. And what that does is that it weakens the democratic desire. Why? Because these people are corrupt. And there was a president, his name was Carlos Prios Socarrás, democratic, charming, good looking, but he was as crooked as they get. And Batista staged a coup against him, and almost nobody came out to defend Carlos Prios Socarrás because they knew how corrupt he was. So I'm very careful about explaining that, some people say, well, authoritarianism and dictatorship began in Cuba when Fidel Castro took over. No, that's not true. It started in 1952. And then you have to even go back further in time to the 1940s when the democratic leaders really abused their power, and they stole money by the millions. And all of these are factors that led to 1959.
So tell us about Fidel Castro. Where did he come from? What are his roots? And why did he become a revolutionary? Why did he feel that he had to go up against Batista and overthrow him?
Yes. Fidel Castro was the son of a very wealthy man in the eastern part of Cuba. He was somebody who, interestingly enough, came from Spain, settled, and he was a rustler. He was a corrupt man, and he managed to amass large amounts of land. And he was a provider of wood and other products for a very large American-owned plantation. So he became very wealthy. Now, however, I should say that Fidel Castro was an illegitimate child. So even though that was his father, he did not grow up in that household. He was actually sent to live with a Haitian consul in Santiago de Cuba, and then later on was sent to a school for rich kids, which was a Jesuit school called Colegio Dolores. And it's interesting that he did not fit socially. yes, his father was wealthy, but he had no social standing. So his classmates would make fun of him socially. They would call him a hick. And he had many attributes. I mean, one of them was physical strength. And I wrote actually a few years ago a piece that tells the story, and just pay attention to what kind of a child this was. He was 12 years old, and this is 1940. Roosevelt wins yet another election, and Fidel Castro at age 12 goes to the office in the school, gets some stationery, and writes a handwritten letter to none other than FDR, congratulating him. This is the day after he won, so he was listening to the results over the radio, and he says, "I've never seen a $20 bill." He calls it a green American $20 bill. And he asks Roosevelt for a bill. And then he says, he calls him my friend, and he says, just listen to what was going through his brain. He says, and this is before the United States is even considering seriously going into World War II. And he says, near where I live, there's a mine which has great amounts of iron, which you could use for your vessels. This is a 12-year-old. Now, somebody in the White House responded. The $20 bill was not there. Castro goes into a fit because of that. He felt humiliated. And years later, all of that flowered up, when he went to, in 1959, when he went to the White House to see if the United States would be willing to work with the Cuban revolutionaries. Eisenhower has no time for him. He's going out to play golf, and he sends instead Richard Nixon, who was the vice president. And at that time, he sort of relived the experience of asking for money and then the United States not delivering it. At that time, his brother Raúl was in the Soviet Union in negotiations. Fidel Castro comes out of that meeting fuming because Richard Nixon had treated him like a little kid. He speaks with his brother over the phone and gives him a green light. He says, you know what, we can't expect anything from the United States. Try to do something with the Soviets because that's going to be our course. You see, that's one of the themes. There's an arrogance in U.S. foreign policy, not just towards Cuba, but towards all of Latin America. And when you make those decisions, when you mistreat the leadership of these countries, when you look down upon them, there's a way in which all of these grievances sort of rise up to the occasion.
So Castro, as a young boy, felt snubbed or disrespected by FDR because he didn't get a $20 bill.
Yeah.
More importantly, he felt like he wasn't being listened to, I guess. And then perhaps Richard Nixon, the same thing. I actually saw a little documentary the other night that showed Castro and Nixon coming out of a meeting together, and it looked awkward. It looked very awkward. So Batista was exiled in, I think it was January 1st or early in January 1959. Now, tell me about the revolution itself. What was going on as far as the forces that Fidel Castro was mustering versus the army that Batista had at his disposal?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because when people think of the Cuban Revolution and who were the protagonists, the three that come up are, of course, Fidel Castro, his brother Raúl, and Che Guevara. But when you have a full picture of the insurgency against Batista, the number of groups that rose up, urban groups, democratic organizations, labor unions, it was a broad range of organizations. Many of them were liberal, And Fidel Castro was just a small player. When you look at, and I forget the exact date, but at one point, Fidel Castro, knowing that he was just a minor player among the other revolutionaries, he was begging to be the mayor of Havana. He knew that he would not be the leader, so he was positioning himself. Now, what happened was that, and I think this is true, and some people don't like to hear this, but Fidel Castro was the last man standing. Why? There was a host of revolutionary leaders that people don't know about. Frank Pais, for example, who was a 24-year-old Baptist school teacher, one of the bravest Cubans. He had so much respect. He was an urban leader, and he believed in civilian rule. Fidel Castro was in the highlands with his brother, and the highlands were very well protected. But in the lowlands, the authorities were exterminating all of these rebels and revolutionaries. So in the end, it was Fidel Castro who very astutely triangulated power. So he would pit one group against the other, and then he would be the last standing, which is a skill that he honed. And he actually applied it in the international globe, pitting the superpowers one against another, the US and the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union and China. He was a master at that.
He really was. So, did I read that Batista left Cuba with a lot of money?
Yes. Unfortunately, it was the Cuban way. The previous presidents, Grau San Martin and then Prio Socarrás, they took enormous amounts of money with them. In the case of Batista, they left. It was January 1st. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning. He knew that the revolutionaries were coming close, so he decided to have a party. Well, he was going to have a New Year's Eve party anyway. But he used the occasion to invite his friends and associates. And then around 2 o'clock in the morning, they all started running to go to the airplanes, and they took the money with them, millions and millions of dollars. Now, some people believe in karma. I'm not sure. But when he got to the Dominican Republic, well, actually, the United States government wanted him out, but he rejected. He rejected that offer, and it was too late. Once he was out, he wanted to go to the United States. The airplanes were going towards Florida, and he did not get permission to land there. So he had to stop in Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic, where there was another dictator. And the dictator stopped him and took, I think, maybe half of all the money that Batista had. So he was taxed. He was taxed.
Stop and pay toll, right?
Yes.
Where did he end up? Where did Batista end up?
He ended up in Spain, and I think I think it's Portugal where he ended up. Yeah.
So now you've got Fidel Castro. At this point, now it's 1959. He has taken power. You talked about two other players in this, his brother Raul, who had actually visited the Soviet Union at this point, but also you mentioned Che Guevara. And he's an interesting character himself. He was not a Cuban, right? He was from Argentina.
He was from Argentina. He was a revolutionary. He was an idealist.
Mm-hmm.
And I give them that credit, which I can't give to Fidel Castro, who was not an idealist. He was more of a manipulator. He allowed others to make mistakes and then profit from them. But Che Guevara was a true believer. As many things as we can say about him, the fact that he led so many executions in Havana, but he believed in, he was an idealist. He favored the Chinese model versus the Soviet model. In China, the revolution was one of, rapid transformation to an almost full socialist system. The Soviets were very gradualists at this. They were reformists. And Che Guevara believed that the Chinese had it right. And that created some tensions within Cuba. there's a process called the Great Debate, in which there were different formulas, and Cuba in its revolutionary infancy was trying to figure out, where should we go? Is it China, or is it the Soviet Union, or should we just remain with great autonomy?
He wanted China, and Raul wanted the Soviet Union.
Yes.
Okay. And Fidel was just figuring out whether they could have autonomy or whether he had to embrace one or the other. And at this point, Fidel is still not, or not considering himself a communist or saying he's a communist, right? As far as 1959 is concerned, would you say?
Definitely not. Again, some of the Viva Castro crowd, they get angry when I say that he was actually a fascist.
Mhm.
That's what he was. He was strongly influenced by Spanish fascism. He was not a communist. And I'll tell people, well, to be a communist, you have to be disciplined. And Castro did not believe in being disciplined under any other authority. That's the kind of leader that he was.
But he wanted to be recognized. So we do know that eventually Castro does embrace the Soviet Union. And that brings us to the next stage of the story. But I think when I think about the Castro, is he ready for this power that he has now? You said there were so many factions of the revolutionaries, and so many were being killed during the revolution, and that he ends up on top. Did he consider himself ready at that time to lead Cuba?
He certainly considered himself capable, but he had doubts as to whether this whole revolutionary experiment would survive. Why? Because he was a student of history. He knew how close the United States was, and he believed, like most Cubans, that the United States would not allow something of that sort to take root only 90 miles away. There were several factors that came together. One, as I said, there is a escape valve. Exiles leaving Cuba, had they been forced to stay, had the United States not been so close, they would have been forced to stay and fight. And actually, few people know that there were guerrillas that were fighting against the revolutionaries, and Che Guevara was leading the efforts against them. So some Cubans did fight. Bay of Pigs, we know, was a fiasco. And what the Bay of Pigs did was several things. It presented Castro as the champion of anti-imperialism, not just in the Americas, but the world. His stature was elevated. And then it was clear that after that, it would be very, very hard to bring him down from power.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Bay of Pigs. So can you give us just a little summary of what that was? What was the United States involvement in that?
Well, it was orchestrated by the CIA, and it included an interesting collection of anti-Castro leaders. Some of them were very progressive leaders, Democrats. Some of them were associated with the Batista regime, and they came together. It was over 1,000 of them that launched this attack. Kennedy was not really supportive of it, just halfway supportive. And there were orders for the bombings of the Cuban airfields to stop. The airplanes that survived were instrumental in beating the attackers. The attackers that survived were thrown into container trucks. And this is another chapter that few people know about. They were taken from the southern coast, where the Bay of Pigs is, to Havana, and in these airtight containers, and I forget the exact number, but at least 30 of them suffocated to death. It was a fiasco. The United States did not support. And once Cuba won that battle, it was able to send the message that it had given, and these were roughly Castro's words, we have given U.S. imperialism its first defeat ever. And again, that elevated him. He consolidated power. Still at that point, the vast majority of the Cuban population supported Castro. That is true. It must be acknowledged. And then the rest is history. That was the last attempt.
Big embarrassment for the brand new Kennedy administration. I think he was inaugurated in January and Bay of Pigs was in April of 61, I believe. So instant embarrassment. I think the thing is that Kennedy was fearful of being found out about our involvement in this Bay of Pigs invasion, that we had a hand in it. But in that fear, it appears that he backed off enough to really ensure the failure of the invasion.
Yes.
By the exiled forces that had been assembled to accomplish this and had been aided by the CIA as well. So it was a complete disaster. So now the United States is clearly found out that we were involved in some way. And Castro is now a hero. It's sort of, he's consolidated public opinion more. Is this when Castro decides about communism and the Soviet Union? Is that the point at which he makes up his mind, do you think?
That's the point when he was able to implement some of the radical actions, one of them being completely nationalizing education. So private schools, Catholic schools, they were all closed. Che Guevara had been a communist, more than sympathizer. He was a communist. Fidel Castro wasn't. But right after the Bay of Pigs, Fidel Castro is able to say that this is a communist revolution and it will always remain communist.
So let's now talk about Castro and Khrushchev. How and when did that relationship start, and how did the missiles and thousands of Soviet troops get into Cuba?
It wasn't the best of relations because Khrushchev was a reformist. And by that, I mean that he was in favor of having a mixed economy in which state-run businesses and factories and agricultural activities coexist with private enterprises. Cuban communists, particularly Che Guevara, wanted to put a complete end to that. And the way it happened was that in 1963, there's a severe crisis in Cuba, even though Castro doesn't want to be fully under the orbit of Soviet control. There's a recognition that here the United States and Cuba have cut all trade. Cuba produces sugar. Cubans would like to diversify the economy, Fidel Castro included, but what the Soviets want is to exercise a similar type of control over Cuba than that the United States had before. In other words, the Soviets don't want a diversified economy for Cuba. Why? Because they're under control. And here we are, the Soviets, we're going to buy your sugar, Cuba. And not only that, but we're going to pay more for your sugar than the international market. And China, well, China didn't have as big of a market for the sugar. So it's the Soviets that are able to recreate a situation of dependency. You buy our stuff and we'll buy your sugar. Yes, we're going to pay you even more than the world market. That sounds like a good deal, but in the end, it did not allow Cubans to diversify their economy.
So that was 1963, but if you back that up a little bit, 1962, the actual missiles being brought into Cuba, did Castro invite Khrushchev to bring the missiles in to defend Cuba against a possible U.S. invasion, or did Khrushchev say, we need to do this?
No, Castro invited them, yes.
Mhm.
And actually, he was quite upset. And this gives you a sense of his psyche. He was very upset when the Soviets removed him, to the point that he didn't talk to Soviet leaders for several months. It's hard for me to say it, but he was upset that the world did not come to an end and Cuba be in the epicenter of that final battle.
That's a little terrifying if you think of having a leader who is willing to have you, if you're one of his countrymen, annihilated to make a point.
Yeah. That's what the exaggerated sense of honor
Hmm.
that some of these caudillos have. It's,
Yeah.
if it takes the destruction of the world, so be it.
So you left Cuba just prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis, did you, Luis?
Yes, and it was good timing, because then after that, the flights were temporarily, for a good 3 years or so, they were stopped. So
Stop.
had we not left that June of 62, then we would have not been able to leave until 65, 66.
So have you heard of any people you've spoken to who were there during the missile crisis and afterwards? Do you know of what was Cuba like thinking that, hey, we've got this foreign army now? Like, I think there were more than 40,000 Soviet troops and many, many missiles, and that, the United States might invade. There might be a nuclear war. This may be the end. What was the reaction of the Cuban people, to your knowledge, during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, it was very short-lived, right? It was 10 days.
Ah,
So from the time that it became public that these missiles were already there and more were on their way, until the time that the crisis was averted. Um, I've spoken more with people who were in the United States and young people who were in school. And the sense was that this might be the end of the world. I'm not, in terms of Cuba, because there was no free press, not so much information flowed to the public. And I wish I could have a better answer, but I'm not really sure how domestically Castro and the regime treated this. It wouldn't be hard to do that if you go to the newspaper Granma, which, by the way, was the only newspaper in communist Cuba, which was a country that had dozens upon dozens upon dozens of newspapers before it ended up with just having a newspaper that it's still circulating. It's 4 pages. This is from a country that had a long tradition of excellence in journalism.
yeah, no, actually, you gave a very good answer to that, Luis, that the people were kept largely in the dark because the newspapers were not allowed to really probably give the dire situation that they were in. But I think it sounds like Castro enjoyed the fact that he was the epicenter,
Yes.
but ultimately we learned that Kennedy and Khrushchev then became the two major players and kind of pushed Castro off to the side, didn't they? How did he take that?
He did not like that at all, because, in the end, it was a deal between the United States and the Soviet Union, and did not take Cuba into consideration. And he was upset that he was not at the epicenter of the final solution to that crisis.
Yeah, it was a terrifying time from what I've heard. Now, one of the reasons I'm very interested in that period of time and kind of what the world was facing then was that, and I've mentioned this to you when we spoke earlier, my dad used to take slides instead of the regular photographs, he'd have slides and they'd be put on a carousel and then you'd watch them on a screen and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Well, I was 4.5 years old in October 1962, and there's a photograph of myself, I think my brother and somebody else on a couch with our Halloween costumes on. There's a newspaper on the coffee table in front of us, and it's announcing. I gotta find that photograph and actually duplicate it. Maybe I'll post it to our website or Facebook for our podcast. But there was an announcement about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how scary it was. And I'm almost glad that I am glad that I was not old enough to really know what was going on, because my older brother, I think he was 11 at the time, he was terrified, as many people were. But it sounds to me like maybe the Cuban people, unless they had regular interactions with some of the Soviet troops who may have known more, I would imagine they weren't as scared.
My parents, I'm sure, were watching this closely,
Sure.
and I was just 2 years old, so I don't remember anything. But years later, actually writing columns on the 60th anniversary of the missile crisis, I was doing some research, and I read that the missiles could go as far south as Lima, Peru,
Oh,
which I
geez.
thought was very funny, that we weren't even safe
Not.
there.
Oh, neither. I'm sure neither were we, being so close to New York City. So when the missiles were disassembled, I know Kennedy made a sort of a secret agreement to remove missiles from Turkey. So Khrushchev got that out of it. That didn't help Castro at all. Didn't help his cause, but it helped Khrushchev there to save face and also to have us remove our missiles. And then, of course, Kennedy was able to negotiate getting the missiles removed from Cuba. So you've got now Castro's declared himself a communist. You mentioned what happened after that, and as far as the Soviet Union trying to become the sole customer of sugar and I guess other products. So again, sort of having the upper hand in Cuba economically, which was not optimal for Castro. So Luis, let me just ask you this question. If you fast forward to early 1990s, late 1980s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, what was that effect on Fidel Castro and his leadership at the time?
Yes, as the Soviet Union was moving in a reformist direction, glasnost, perestroika, Fidel Castro, who has always had a contrarian side to him, decided to move in the other direction and actually to strengthen very doctrinaire communism. And part of that was to stop or heavily tax and actually ban many of the private economic activities that individuals had engaged in. So it was going in the opposite direction. It was very sudden. Cuba had come to depend on the Soviet market for its sugar and also to receive its oil from the Soviet Union. And it was almost overnight. In a matter of 2 years, all of that ended. That forced the Cuban revolution to go into a survivalist mode. And Option Zero, for example, was one of the programs. There was no electricity. There was no gasoline. Cuba was forced to withdraw temporarily from the world market. Now, what allowed Cuba to survive, and this was a coincidence, a historical coincidence, that Venezuela, which was another oil-producing country, was able to step in and keep Cuba from really collapsing completely. I mean, if you look at the statistics, what happened was a 35% drop in the economy in a matter of 1 or 2 years. Venezuela moved in to that vacuum and was now offering Cuba subsidized oil. And without oil, Cuba couldn't function.
Oh, so okay. So Venezuela stepped in to the spot that was left open by the Soviet Union uh,
Yes.
collapsing. Very interesting. So many different dynamics, aren't there? So, Luis, recently the Queen of England passed away, and my whole life, she was always the Queen. It was kind of the same with Castro for me. He was always the head of Cuba up until early 2000s, like 2008 or something like that. And then, of course, when his brother took over, it was still a Castro, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
How did Fidel Castro survive? I think I may have screwed this up, but I think he said something like, if surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic sport, I would be a gold medalist or something. It was something along those lines.
Yes.
He was durable, wasn't he? How did he stay alive? How did he stay in power?
Some people take that to mean that he's popular, the fact that he was not killed. But we shouldn't underestimate the kind of national security system, the espionage, the internal espionage, how the East German intelligence was so helpful in setting up Cuba's counterintelligence and intelligence systems. That's one thing. You can't have organized opposition, because anybody who dared, even 2 or 3 people sitting down to talk against the regime, people would know about it. Why? Because it's a system of espionage. It's hard for us to relate because we believe that there's a sanctity of the home, and any conversation that you have with your family is safe. But in a country like that, you would have neighborhood organizations whose sole, well, not sole, but one of the main charges was to keep an eye on any threat, domestic or external. And if they see, you coming home with packages, and they immediately want to know what that was about, and they will go to your house and ask you questions, and there could be a search. It's hard for us, again, because we live in a democracy. It's a flawed democracy, but we don't think that those kinds of things could happen. Somebody in the middle of the night knocking on our door and finding whether we have documents or whether we have, any other thing. It doesn't happen in this country. So we shouldn't underestimate the power of the police, the state police. On the other hand, Fidel Castro was charismatic, very intelligent. He managed to surround himself with people that he could trust. Anybody that even remotely showed some signs of not being in line with his thinking, he would get rid of in a variety of ways. So it's a combination. It's a combination of an extraordinarily intelligent man who had a large ego, who wanted to be at the epicenter of everything. One of the things that Castro did, that he would talk about anything. Cattle. Oh, yes, I know about cattle. The generation of electricity. Yes, I know about that. Sugar production. He would speak on every subject, not because he knew about every subject, but because he had this convincing power that he was in control. Having said all of this, it is still a mystery to me how he managed to stay in power that long. You mentioned some of the attempts on his life. Many of them were botched. Some of them were just crackpot ideas. This is true. It's funny, but when he came to New York in 1959, there was somebody in the CIA thought that it would be, if we could just bring down his image and the charisma, the mystique of his beard. So somebody thought about, I don't think they do this anymore except in very luxurious hotels, but you would leave your shoes outside the door for shoe shine. So a CIA agent put some depilatory agent in his shoes with a hope that his beard would fall off. If you can imagine, that kind of scheme. It didn't happen. The beard didn't fall off, and he died with his beard decades later.
I wonder how many levels of approval that got before it was attempted. I did hear that about trying to get his beard to fall off, and I'm glad I heard it from you, because I thought to myself, they were trying anything. They were trying to everything but the kitchen sink to get Castro out of power, but he stayed in, as you said, for various reasons. I mean, he was charismatic in some ways and knowledgeable and smart. He had a law degree, didn't he?
He had a law degree. I don't think he ever practiced, because he married. Not only did he come from a powerful family in Cuba, but he married into an elite family, the Diaz-Balart family. And he married into that family, and he found some protection there because he was involved in a 1953 attempt at a military coup. He was captured along with almost all of the other participants, including his brother. Unfortunately, some of them were killed and some of them were tortured, but because he was so well connected, that his life was spared. The Bishop of Santiago interceded on his behalf, and his life was spared.
That's incredible. Now, as far as his successor, Fidel Castro's successor, his brother Raul, he was in power for quite a while as well. And what happened to Cuba that was different, maybe under Raul Castro's regime?
Yes, it's interesting because the roles were inverted. Early on, Fidel Castro was the more idealistic one. Raul Castro was the harsh, the hardline, pro-Soviet one. He was feared, and actually the Castros played on that. And once Fidel Castro said, if anything happens to me, it's going to be worse because you're going to get my brother. Over the decades, those roles were inverted. So Raul Castro in the 90s and early years of this century became sort of the good cop.
Yeah.
And by good cop, I mean that he said, for example, and I'm paraphrasing, that we need more rice and beans than bullets to stabilize this society. So he was, again, towards the end of his life, he had softened.
Now, is Raul Castro still living?
He's still living. We don't hear much of him. I don't think he's in good health. He's quite there in age, but he's out of the public view.
And one other player, just to sort of as a postscript, you mentioned Che Guevara. And I also read that he was a medical doctor. He ran against Castro a bit in their ideology, and he took off for other nations to rally people around revolutionary causes in other countries. What actually happened to Che Guevara?
Yes, Che Guevara, again, was the consummate idealist. He believed in the export of revolution. He himself was from Argentina. He had gone to Guatemala as a revolutionary. There was a military coup, CIA-backed coup, and then he had to flee. He went to Mexico. That's where he met Fidel Castro and other Cuban revolutionaries. And it's important to know that the Soviet Union at this point does not want that kind of internationalism. They don't want another Cuba. Of course, they would love to see the world map painted red, but they did not believe that at that time, the alternative of a revolutionary guerrilla movement taking power was the ideal thing. They believed in working with reformist governments. So that was at odds with Che Guevara's view of exporting revolution. He did that in Africa. Later on, he wanted to export revolution to South America. He believed that if he could start a nucleus, a guerrilla nucleus in Bolivia, that would spread to the rest of South America, which he believed was ripe for this kind of revolution. So that was at odds with the Soviets. And because Fidel Castro was moving closer and closer to the Soviets, that sort of separated them. And he decided to go on his own and be an internationalist.
And he was eventually captured by the Bolivian government forces,
yes,
and executed. Is that right?
He was executed, yes. And his body was mutilated. And I think it was his hands that were left behind in Bolivia. And only about 15 or 20 years ago, they were returned for the unification of the body. Yeah, it's interesting that Che Guevara always represented that idealism. So when there were times in Cuba when the government couldn't really, because of economic circumstances, could not deliver material goods. And by that, I mean quality education, quality medical care, housing, better diets. Whenever the government was in that position, they would elevate, resurrect actually, Che Guevara, because Che Guevara was also a symbol of sacrifice. So they were invoke the idealist Che Guevara.
Wow, this is certainly a very interesting history, the revolutionary history of Cuba, as well as, of course, the earlier periods, which you gave us a little bit of a summary on. Cuba is a fascinating country, its history. I'm so glad that people like you, who also have a vested interest in it, you talked about the heart and soul that AI doesn't have, and you tell it with such passion. You know, you've got family history in the country, and that's something that's really important. It's like me, I'm from an English Irish background predominantly, and when I read history of that area of the world, there's something inside me that just sort of like, you just feel that attachment. And I feel you have the same thing. I feel that you have that. It's like a deep love for the land and the people and the history. And when the country gets wounded, you feel wounded.
Yeah.
When the history is, goes in one direction or another, you feel like, man, I want to know why and what happened.
Yes.
And who were the people involved. And you just really speak with a lot of passion, and you write with passion. Your book, Revolutionary Cuba History, certainly goes far beyond just the early revolutionary years, but it sort of takes the reader through to the present day. And I really thank you for writing that book. You mentioned your book, The World Turned Upside Down. You told us about that a bit, but what other future projects do you have, Luis?
Well, first, let me say something pertaining to what you said about the passion and the need that people have. I don't need to tell you that we live in times when history is not as important, is not as respected, is not as valued. But even in these times of what I call STEM bullying, history survives. And we teach it in schools and high schools and colleges, and students major in history. Why? I am convinced that as human beings, we have a need to connect with our past.
Yes.
If for no other reason, just so that we understand the mistakes that were made before, I think it's part of our DNA, a need to connect with that history. And it's not universal, but for those of us who see history as a means to understand not just the present, but the future. In my book, When the World Turned Upside Down, even though historians are not supposed to talk about the future, I do. And why do I do that? Well, I'm a strong believer that historians are trained to use a telescope to look to the past.
Yep.
But that same telescope, we can turn around and look to the future and sort of make informed statements about what may happen. What may happen in Ukraine, for example? What may happen in this country in the next elections? We are, I would say, better equipped as historians to do that than other social scientists.
I agree completely. And my undergraduate degree was in history. And somebody said to me, why are you interested in something it's happened already? Who cares? I mean, it's done. Maybe it's interesting, but what value really is it to study history? And I said, it's become maybe a canned answer, but I believe it 100% is you can really, what happened in the past can and often does affect what happens in the future. And it is really a study of human behavior, human responses to different
Yes.
circumstances and events, and the ideologies that are at work. And you've really sparked my interest to go back and start studying Latin America, Caribbean history, because it is absolutely fascinating. And we're such close neighbors, 90 miles, right? Cuba's 90 miles off the coast of Florida. You are so close to the nation of your birth, aren't you?
Yes, and so distant at the same time.
Yeah.
Which makes it a little bit painful. I wish I could hop on a plane and spend the weekend in Havana and visit my relatives and enjoy my country, but it's not possible. And
Maybe
for
someday.
me, history has been a connector to understand that history, to bring it close to me, to celebrate people like Jose Marti, for example, to celebrate the Cuban patriots of the 19th century. It's important, and it's beautiful. History is beautiful.
You are sharing with your readers, your students, and we're all benefiting from your passion to really bring history alive from that part of the world. And thank you so much for what you do. And thank you for being a guest on Your History, Your Story, because storytelling is what we're all about. And
Yes.
you are an excellent storyteller, Luis.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for doing this for the other authors and thinkers and historians. We really appreciate you playing this role to help magnify our message.
Yes. And what's your next book?
I was asked that question earlier today, actually. I always have a book in front of me, two or three of them in my brain swirling around. I just can't help it. I think I'm going to continue along the lines of a global history. And the idea that I have is to write a history of the world as told by its statues. And I'm even playing with the title, Cast in Bronze and Chiseled Out of Stone, A History of the World.
Oh, I love that. I love it. Let's start with that, then right around it.
Yes.
Luis, thank you so much. Have a great day, and God bless.
Thank you. I'm in. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your History, Your Story. You can connect with us on Facebook and YouTube at Your History, Your Story, or on Instagram and Twitter at YHYS Podcast. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or a story to tell. Be well, and God bless.